4 men are ruining my death flag. A. Bloom under 4 Sons story system warning character. Extra number 27. Disposable rival death flag proximity, 12% and rising. Recommended action, reduce screen time. Immediately, the words hung in the air in front of Yohan's face, glowing faint gold, visible to absolutely nobody but him. He was standing in the middle of a hallway lined with marble columns and floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a school uniform that had clearly been tailored for someone with better posture than he'd ever managed in his life. And he was having a very quiet, very internal crisis. Because 3 days ago, Yohan had fallen asleep at 2 in the morning with his phone open to chapter 41 of Bloom under 4 Sons. A BL dating sim he was not proud of loving as much as he did, and woken up inside it. Not as the protagonist, not as any of the 4 devastatingly gorgeous male leads. He had woken up as extra number 27, a background character with exactly one narrative function: to exist near the protagonist just long enough to get humiliated, then vanish from the story forever sometime around the cultural festival. Yohan knew all of this in the specific, useless way you know things about a hobby you never expected to become load-bearing. He'd played the demo 3 times before launch. He'd read every developer diary. He'd stayed up far too many nights arguing in comment sections about which of the 4 Sons had the best route, back when route meant a branching dialogue tree, and not apparently an actual living, breathing person who might now decide to kiss him or ruin his life, depending on how the next few weeks went. He knew this because he had read the wiki. He had read the wiki obsessively, and the wiki was very clear that vanish from the story forever was less of a metaphor and more of a mechanic. Extras who lingered too long, who accumulated too much unearned attention from any of the 4 Sons, got flagged. And flagged extras did not get graceful exits. They got quietly removed. A phrase the fandom had spent 300 forum posts arguing about, because nobody could agree if it meant expulsion, memory wipe, or something worse. And Yohan had exactly 0 interest in being the one to find out which. So the plan was simple. Stay invisible. Stay boring. Let Kang Minjun, the actual protagonist, tragic orphan turned scholarship student turned inevitable heartthrob magnet, collect his 4 love interests like Pokemon and survive quietly in the background until graduation, at which point Yohan fully intended to figure out how to wake back up. It was a good plan. Yohan had even written it down on the back of his hand in pen like a to-do list. 1. Be boring. 2. Stay unseen. 3. Do not under any circumstances become plot relevant. He'd spent an embarrassing number of real-world hours on that wiki, back when this had still been a game and not his actual, current, terrifying life. He remembered the fan theories about Extra No. 27 specifically, a running joke in the comment sections, actually, because the character had no lines, no name anyone bothered to learn, and exactly 1 confirmed appearance in the game's files, tagged with a single, ominous line of developer notes, removed prior to final release narrative interference. At the time, Yohan had thought that was a fun bit of trivia. Now that he was the narrative interference in question, it felt considerably less fun. It was a good plan. It lasted 4 hours. Part 1. The 4 Sons Yohan learned their names before he ever saw their faces, because the entire school talked about them like weather patterns, inevitable, dramatic, impossible to ignore. Han Seojin, student council president, 3rd year. Cold enough that rumor said he'd once made a first-year cry just by looking at him wrong, and beautiful in the specific, engineered way of someone drawn by an artist being paid extra for cheekbones. In the game, Seojin's route was built entirely around thawing him, 3 separate story arcs just to get him to smile on screen. Yu Daeon, 2nd year, Yohan's exact age. Golden retriever energy in human form, the kind of relentlessly warm that made people forget he was, statistically, the strongest fighter in the entire school. In the game, he was Minjun's designated childhood best friend, the safest, softest route, the one players did first to ease into the harder ones. Choi Tiong, 3rd year, permanent scowl, motorcycle parked illegally outside the gates every single day. Delinquent route, soft underneath, obviously, because they always were, but the game made you earn 11 full chapters of glaring before he admitted it. And just Jiho, transfer student, no surname given even in the game files, which the fandom had spent literal years theorizing about. Route 4, the final, hardest unlock. Something about him that felt less like a character and more like a variable. Yohan intended to interact with precisely none of them. He made it to lunch. Part 2. Glitch 1, the cafeteria was loud and enormous, and Yohan had a plan: sit at the far table by the window, eat quickly, exist minimally. And the plan was going fine right up until he tripped over absolutely nothing, sent his tray flying, and braced for the humiliating floor-meets-face experience that was surely coming. It didn't come. Instead, a hand caught his elbow with the kind of effortless precision that suggested its owner had never once in his life fumbled anything. And Yohan looked up into the coldest, most beautiful face he had ever seen in his life, currently wearing an expression of profound confusion. "You're fine," Han Seojin said, in a voice like he was surprised to hear himself say it. Yohan's brain helpfully supplied the system window that flickered open in the corner of his vision. Anomaly detected character SEOJIN has deviated from scripted behavior. Scripted response to background collision. Ignore. Actual response. Physical intervention. Recalculating. "Thanks," Yohan said very quietly to both the system and the boy still holding his elbow like he hadn't quite decided to let go yet. Seojin didn't answer. He looked at his own hand on Yohan's arm like it belonged to someone else, released it a half-second too late, and walked away without another word. But not before Yohan caught him glancing back exactly once from the doorway, jaw tight, like a man annoyed at his own hallway reflexes. Yohan sat down very carefully, picked his tray back up, and whispered to the empty air, "That was a fluke. That doesn't count." Death flag proximity, 14%. The system, unfortunately, did not agree. Interlude. A reasonable amount of panic. Yohan spent that entire evening, locked in his dorm room, having what he considered a perfectly reasonable amount of panic, muttering strategy at a ceiling that had no useful advice to offer. "Okay," he said out loud, pacing a track into the floor. "Okay, 1 percentage point isn't the end of the world. People bump elbows with the student council president all the time, probably. That's a normal, forgettable background-tier interaction." He stopped pacing. He looked back at the door, though. That wasn't nothing. Background characters don't get looked back at. A system window flickered open, small and almost smug. Tip: extras with elevated death flag proximity are advised to reduce all future interaction with primary characters to 0. "Yes, thank you, I'm aware," Yohan told it. "Do you have any tips that are actually useful, like how to leave? Or how to make 4 extremely attractive fictional men stop looking at me like I'm a puzzle they want to solve?" The system did not respond. The system, Yohan was beginning to suspect, was less a helpful narrator and more a smoke alarm. Good at announcing a problem, useless at putting it out. He went to bed telling himself, very firmly, that tomorrow would be different. Part 3, Glitch 2. Daeon found him 2 days later, sitting alone on the rooftop during a free period Yohan had specifically chosen because nobody ever came up there. "You're the guy Seojin caught," Daeon said, dropping down beside him with zero regard for personal space, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You're famous now? Well, infamous. He's never touched anyone by accident in his life." "It wasn't a whole thing," Yohan said. "It was a huge thing," Daeon said cheerfully, and then, without asking, reached over and stole half of Yohan's rice cake off his plate like they'd known each other for years instead of 40 seconds. "What's your name?" "Yohan." "Yohan," Daeon repeated, testing it out like he was filing it away somewhere permanent. Then he smiled, warm and easy and entirely too bright for a background character to survive being on the receiving end of, and said, "I'm going to come find you at lunch tomorrow, too." Anomaly detected character DAON initiating unscripted social bonding with extra no. 27. Threat to primary route, moderate. Recommend immediate distancing. Yohan tried. He genuinely tried. He said, "You really don't have to," in his most disinterested voice, the one he'd practiced specifically for this exact situation. Daeon just grinned wider, stole the rest of the rice cake, and said, "I want to, though." Like that settled it, because apparently in Daeon's world it did. Death flag proximity. 19%, true to his word, Daeon found him again the next day. And the day after that. Within a week it had stopped feeling like something being done to Yohan and started feeling, disconcertingly, like something he looked forward to. The particular chaos of Daeon appearing with 2 lunch trays instead of 1. Already talking before he'd even sat down. Filling every silence Yohan hadn't realized he'd been leaving open for someone to fill. "You're doing the thing again," Daeon said one afternoon, squinting at him over a shared plate of dumplings. "What thing?" "The thing where you look like you're waiting for someone to notice you and then panic when they do." Daeon said it lightly, but his eyes were sharper than his tone, watching Yohan's face with more attention than his easy grin usually let on. "You don't have to brace for it every time, you know. I'm not going anywhere." Yohan didn't have a system window ready for that one. He just sat there, a little stunned, and let Daeun steal the last dumpling without complaint. Part 4, Glitch 3. Choi Taeyong did not seek him out. Choi Taeyong, in fact, actively ignored him for an entire week, which Yohan considered a personal victory right up until the afternoon 3 second years cornered him behind the gym over a debt he didn't owe and had never heard of, because apparently even background extras got dragged into plots that weren't theirs. Yohan was doing an admirable job of talking his way out of it, mostly by being boring and unthreatening enough that violence felt like a waste of everyone's time. When a shadow fell over the whole group, and the 3 second years went the color of old paper. Leave, Taeyong said. One word. He didn't even raise his voice. They left. Fast. Taeyong looked at Yohan like he was mildly annoyed to have had to intervene at all, shoved his hands in his pockets, and said, "You're the one Daeun won't shut up about." "I really am nobody," Yohan said with total sincerity, which was possibly the most honest thing he'd said since arriving in this world. Taeyong's mouth did something that was almost a smirk. "Sure." He turned to go, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder in a way that felt suspiciously deliberate for someone with a scripted personality of aggressively disinterested. "Don't walk home alone. Those 3 have friends." Then he was gone, and Yohan was left standing behind the gym having what could generously be described as a small crisis. It didn't help that 2 days later, he caught Taeyong lingering by the front gate at exactly the time school let out, motorcycle idling, expression carefully arranged into something that was trying very hard to look like coincidence and failing spectacularly. "You're not following me home," Yohan said. "Wasn't planning to," Taeyong said, not moving, not leaving, clearly planning to do exactly that. Yohan walked. Taeyong walked the bike alongside him the entire way, saying almost nothing, radiating the specific, stubborn energy of someone who had decided a thing and intended to see it through regardless of whether anyone had asked him to. Anomaly detected character Taeyang has engaged in unsolicited protection behavior toward extra number 27. This is not in his script. This has never once been in his script. Death flag proximity. 27%. "I would like to speak to whoever's running this," Yohan said out loud to nobody to the empty space behind the gym, and got no response, because apparently the universe did not do customer service. Part 5, Glitch 4. Jiho was the one Yohan was most careful around, because Jiho's route was the one nobody in the fandom had ever fully mapped. Hardest to unlock, thinnest wiki page. Community consensus that something about his dialogue trees didn't behave like the others. So when Jiho slid into the seat across from him in the library, uninvited, and said, "You know you're not supposed to be interesting," Yohan's whole body went cold. "Excuse me, you're extra 27. Jiho said it lightly, like commenting on the weather, flipping open a book he clearly wasn't reading. "I've read the files, too." Yohan sat very, very still. "What files?" Jiho looked up, and for one terrible electric second, his eyes weren't the eyes of a character at all. They were the eyes of someone looking back at him from the other side of the fourth wall, someone who knew exactly what a system window was because he'd been staring at his own for a lot longer than 4 days. "You're not the only one who fell asleep reading something they shouldn't have," Jiho said very quietly. And then the moment passed, his expression sliding back into careless normalcy so fast Yohan almost doubted he'd seen it at all. "Relax, I'm not going to report you. I'm mostly just relieved I'm not the only glitch running around this school." Yohan lowered his voice to a near whisper. "You're aware too." "Since Chapter 1, Jiho said. "It's incredibly boring being the only person who knows the ending. You have no idea how nice it is to finally have someone to talk to who isn't running on a script." He tilted his head, studying Yohan with new interest. "Except you're not running on a script either, apparently, which is new. Extras don't usually get their own free will." Critical anomaly, character Jiho has revealed narrative self-awareness to extra number 27. This information was not meant to be accessible at this stage. Death flag proximity, 34%, rising rapidly. "That number is going up because of you?" Yohan hissed at the empty air, and Jiho, who apparently couldn't see the system windows Yohan could, but had clearly gotten very good at reading Yohan's face, just smiled like this was the most fun he'd had in months. Interlude, the protagonist, off-script nobody, least of all Yohan, thought to wonder what Kang Minjun's days actually looked like. Which was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of oversight that got background characters erased. Minjun was, by every objective measure, likable, charming in the effortless, sincere way of someone who genuinely never had to try, laughing easily with a cluster of first years by the vending machines. remembering the names of teachers' pets and cafeteria staff alike, radiating the kind of golden, camera-ready warmth that made people want to stand a little closer to him just to feel some of it rub off. He was, in every way that mattered to a story, exactly what the story needed him to be. What nobody saw, what the story had never bothered to script, because protagonists weren't supposed to need it scripted, was the way his smile dropped the instant he turned a corner and thought no one was watching. The way he'd started counting, without meaning to, how many times a day Siajan's eyes drifted toward the same spot in the courtyard. How many minutes Daeon disappeared during lunch and came back smelling like someone else's rice cakes. How Tiang, who'd never in 3 years walked anyone anywhere, had suddenly developed a nightly route that conveniently passed one specific dorm building. Minjun had spent this whole story being told, implicitly, by every rule of the narrative he'd been born into, that he was the reason any of this existed. That the four of them orbited him not because he'd earned it, but because that was simply what the story was for. He hadn't expected it to hurt, watching that stop being true. He hadn't expected, either, how much angrier that made him than it should have. Part 6. The storm gathers by the second week. Yohan's careful, boring, invisible life had fallen apart so completely that he'd stopped even pretending to fight it. Siajan started, coincidentally, studying in the same library corner. Daeon ate lunch with him every single day without asking permission a second time. Tiang walked him partway home twice, silent the whole way, radiating an aura that dared anyone to comment. Jiho left notes in Yohan's locker written in a code only the two of them understood, half genuine warnings, half just an excuse to talk to someone who existed outside the plot. None of them acknowledged the others. None of them apparently had noticed that they were all doing the exact same thing. Kang Minjun noticed. Yohan felt it before he understood it. The way conversations went quiet when Minjun walked by, the way the protagonist's easy, camera-ready smile never quite reached his eyes anymore when it landed on Yohan. Minjun was supposed to be gathering 4 devoted love interests on a slow, satisfying, canon-approved timeline. Instead, all 4 of his intended romances kept drifting sideways, toward a background character who wasn't even supposed to have a name. "You've been busy," Minjun said one afternoon, cornering Yohan by the shoe lockers with a smile so bright it was almost aggressive. "Siajan, Daeon, Tiang. Even Jiho, and he doesn't talk to anyone." His head tilted, pleasant and terrifying all at once. "That's a lot of attention for someone who isn't anyone." "They're just being nice," Yohan said, which was possibly the weakest lie he had ever told in his life. Minjun's smile didn't move. "Make sure it stays that way." Warning, primary character Minjun has flagged extra number 27 as a narrative threat. Death flag proximity, 48%. Elimination event window. Cultural festival finale, 9 days remaining. Yohan spent that entire night lying awake, staring at the ceiling of a dorm room that wasn't his, doing increasingly frantic math about how a person avoided being erased from a story he hadn't asked to be written into. Part 7. The 4 sons have a meeting. Yohan did not witness what happened next, which he would later consider one of the great tragedies of his life, because by every account he received afterward, from 4 extremely reluctant sources, none of whom agreed on the details, it was the single funniest thing that happened in the entire story. It started because all 4 of them, independently, without consulting one another, decided that same night to go check on him, which meant that at exactly 9:47 p.m., Siajan, Daeon, Tiang, and Jiho arrived outside Yohan's dorm building within 90 seconds of each other and stood there, in a loose, suspicious semicircle, looking at one another like 4 cats who just realized they were all staring at the same food bowl. "Why are you here?" Siajan said, in the flat, dangerous tone he usually reserved for underclassmen who broke curfew. "Could ask you the same thing," Tiang said, arms crossed, already bristling. Daeon, who had never once in his life successfully hidden an emotion, looked genuinely wounded. "Wait, are you guys, do you also?" He gestured helplessly between the 3 of them. "Oh no, oh, this is bad. This is so bad. I've known for 2 weeks, Jiho said, unbothered, leaning against the gate like he'd been waiting for this exact conversation to happen and had already picked out his seat. "I was mostly curious how long it'd take the rest of you to notice you weren't special." Siajan's jaw tightened. "I don't share." "Correction," Jiho said pleasantly. "You've never had to. Different thing entirely." What followed was, by all 4 accounts, 20 extremely tense minutes of posturing, several thinly veiled threats. One moment where Tiang and Xiaojun stood close enough that a first-year walking past genuinely thought a fight was about to break out. And Daeyeon, sweet, golden, conflict-allergic Daeyeon, sitting down on the curb with his head in his hands, muttering, "I liked it better when I thought it was just me being an idiot about this." It was Daeyeon, in the end, who broke the standoff, because Daeyeon was, underneath the golden retriever exterior, considerably sharper than any of them gave him credit for. "Can I say something?" he said, standing back up, "without everyone trying to fight me?" He waited for a general, grudging silence that he took as permission. None of us backed off. That's the whole point, right? He never picked. He never had to, because none of us gave him a reason to stop any of it. So what we're going to make him choose now, after 2 weeks of all of us deciding, separately, that we didn't care if he did? He looked around at the three of them, uncharacteristically serious. "I don't want to lose this over a fight none of us are actually willing to lose. I'd rather share something real than win something that isn't." There was a long silence. "I hate that he's right," Tiang muttered. "I hate it more," Xiaojun said. But some of the tension had gone out of his shoulders, replaced by something that looked, on his usually unreadable face, almost like resignation. "For what it's worth," Jiho said, "I never had any intention of losing him to a fistfight in front of a dorm building, too undignified. I was fully prepared to simply be the best option and let the rest of you eliminate yourselves." "You're insufferable," Xiaojun said. "You're still here talking to me instead of leaving," Jiho pointed out. "So clearly I'm tolerable enough." By the time they finally dispersed, no formal agreement reached, nothing signed or promised, just 4 boys walking away in 4 different directions having quietly, separately, decided not to make anyone choose. None of them told Yohan a single word about it. He found out 3 weeks later, from Daeyeon, who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. And by then it hadn't mattered anyway, because the outcome had already written itself into the shape of his ordinary Tuesdays. Part 9, everything at once the 9 days that followed were, in Yohan's professional opinion as someone who had read a truly unreasonable number of romance novels, deeply unfair, because apparently the universe's response to there is a countdown to your possible erasure, was to make every single one of the 4 sons significantly, catastrophically worse at keeping their hands to themselves. Xiaojun started it unfairly by cornering him after student council duties one evening, both of them alone in the empty classroom, papers stacked between them like a wall neither of them respected. "You should stop being reckless," Xiaojun said, low, standing closer than council business required. "Minjun isn't someone you want paying attention to you." "I've noticed," Yohan said. Xiaojun's hand came up, not fast, not sudden, giving Yohan every chance to step back, and brushed a piece of hair off his forehead with a care that had absolutely nothing to do with student council business. "Then stop making it impossible not to notice you," he said, quiet, almost frustrated like he resented how much he meant it. They stood there a beat too long. Neither of them moved. Yohan's heart was doing something extremely unhelpful, and Xiaojun's eyes had dropped just briefly to his mouth, and the whole room felt like it was holding its breath. And then Daeyeon burst through the door looking for his gym bag, took one look at the two of them standing 3 inches apart in an empty classroom, and said, with the devastating honesty of someone incapable of subtlety, "Oh, were you about to?" "No," Xiaojun said, stepping back so fast he knocked a stack of papers off the desk. Daeyeon did not look convinced. Daeyeon, in fact, looked deeply, personally offended, in a way that suggested he'd been quietly nursing his own version of this exact moment for 2 weeks, and had just watched someone else almost get there first. That night, walking Yohan home under a streetlight that flickered like it was doing it on purpose, Daeyeon was uncharacteristically quiet, hands in his pockets, jaw tight in a way that looked wrong on someone built entirely out of sunshine. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" Daeyeon said finally. "You steal my food and call it bonding. I feel like I already know several embarrassing things about you." Daeyeon laughed, short and a little rough, and stopped walking, which made Yohan stop too. "I don't actually know how to do this the normal way," he admitted. "I've never wanted to, not before you." He reached out, slow, giving Yohan every chance to step back the way Xiaojun had, and cupped his jaw with a warmth that felt like standing in sunlight after a long winter. "Is this okay?" "Yeah," Yohan said, voice smaller than he meant it to be. Daeyeon kissed him like he'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks and had finally been given permission to breathe, soft at first, careful, and then a little less careful when Yohan's hands found the front of his jacket and didn't push him away. When they broke apart, Daeyeon rested his forehead against Yohan's, laughing quietly, disbelieving. "I really thought Xiaojun was going to beat me to that." "You're both insane," Yohan said, which was not a denial, and Daeon grinned like he'd noticed. Tiang found out 2 days later, not through words, but through the simple, damning fact that he showed up outside Yohan's dorm at 9 at night on his motorcycle, helmet under one arm, jaw set in the particular way that meant he'd heard something and had opinions about it. "Get on," he said. "It's a school night." "Get on," Tiang said again, and something in his voice, not angry, just raw, just a little too honest for someone whose entire personality was supposed to be aggressively closed off, made Yohan climb on without another word of protest. They ended up on the roof of an old building overlooking the whole sleeping city. Tiang's jacket around Yohan's shoulders because the night had gone cold, and Tiang had noticed before Yohan had even shivered. "Daeon told me," Tiang said, staring out at the skyline instead of at him. "About the kiss. Are you mad?" "No." A long pause. "Jealous, which is worse." He finally looked over and up close in the dark with the city lights doing something unfair to the sharp lines of his face. He looked almost young, almost unsure, which felt like a crime against his entire established personality. "I've never wanted anything the way I want to be near you. It's inconvenient. I don't like inconvenient things. That's the least romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "I'm not good at the other kind," Tiang admitted, and then, without any further warning, closed the distance and kissed him, nothing careful about it, nothing tentative, just 2 weeks of pent-up frustration finally given somewhere to go. Yohan's hands fisted in his jacket. Tiang's arm wound around his waist and pulled him in like he'd been aching to for far longer than 2 weeks, and by the time they broke apart, they were both a little breathless, foreheads together, the whole city glittering silently below them like it was minding its own business on purpose. "This is a disaster," Yohan said into the quiet. "Yeah," Tiang agreed, sounding entirely too pleased about it. Jiho infuriatingly waited until Yohan was distracted, cornered him in the library stacks where they always talked, and said without preamble, "So, Seojin, Daeon, and Tiang, should I bother or is the roster full?" "There isn't a roster. There's absolutely a roster," Jiho said, amused, leaning against the shelf with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once doubted his own charm. "I've been watching this happen for 2 weeks with the patience of a saint. I'd like a turn." "You knew this whole time and you didn't say anything." "I was doing research," Jiho said. "On you. It's the most interesting thing that's happened to me since I got dropped into this story." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Yohan's ear, unhurried, watching his face the entire time like he was cataloging every reaction. "I know how this story is supposed to end. I know exactly what a death flag looks like from the inside. And I have absolutely no intention of watching you get erased for the crime of being worth falling for." "That's not a confession." "Fine." Jiho's smile softened into something almost unguarded, rare on a face that spent most of its time carefully composed. He leaned in slow enough that Yohan could have stopped him a dozen times over and didn't. The kiss was quieter than the others, less desperate, more like a promise than a question. "There," Jiho murmured against his mouth. "Now it's a confession." System status, unrecognized root conflict detected across all 4 primary characters. Recalculating narrative outcome, recalculation failed. Death flag proximity, 61%. Festival, 3 days. "That's not comforting," Yohan told the empty library, and nobody answered him, because apparently the system had no better idea what to do about this than he did. A brief accounting Yohan found Jiho the next morning specifically to have a breakdown at him, on the theory that Jiho was the only person in this entire world equipped to understand exactly how deranged the last week had been. "I need you to understand," Yohan said, dragging him into the same library corner, voice pitched low and slightly hysterical, "that in the span of 5 days I have been kissed by 3 separate, individually terrifying men, all of whom are apparently fine with this, none of whom discussed it with each other beforehand as far as I know. And I am now sitting across from a 4th who just casually informed me he's been self-aware since Chapter 1 and would also like a turn." "Accurate summary," Jiho said, entirely too pleased with himself. "This isn't normal. Nothing about your situation has been normal since the moment you woke up as a background extra with free will," Jiho pointed out, not unkindly. "I'd stop expecting normal if I were you. It's not coming. That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be reassuring," Jiho said. "It was meant to be true." He tilted his head, studying Yohan with that same unsettling patience he'd had since their very first conversation. "For what it's worth, and I say this as someone who has read this entire story from the outside, I don't think any of them are going to make you choose. I don't think any of them even want to. They're just not going to say that part out loud until someone forces the issue. A small, private smile. Someone probably will, soon. Yohan didn't know yet exactly how right he was. Part 10. The cultural festival finale was, according to the wiki, the single most important scene in the entire game. The moment Kang Minjun stood on the courtyard stage under a canopy of paper lanterns, and one by one secured the devotion of all 4 sons in front of the whole school, cementing his ending forever. Yohan had planned to be nowhere near that stage. He had not planned on being dragged there by Daeon, flanked by Tiang, trailed by Seojin, and quietly steered into position by Jiho. All 4 of them apparently having independently, silently agreed that whatever was about to happen, none of them intended for him to face it alone. The courtyard was packed, lantern lights spilling gold over hundreds of students in festival clothes, laughter and food stalls and someone's badly tuned guitar all blending into the kind of noise that made the whole world feel warm and ordinary, right up until it didn't. Minjun was already on the stage when they arrived, and the moment his eyes landed on the 5 of them walking in together, his carefully maintained smile finally, publicly cracked. "You're supposed to be background," Minjun said, and his voice carried across the courtyard, sharp enough that the crowd's chatter died into silence. "You're supposed to disappear. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked." He turned to the crowd, gesturing at Yohan like presenting evidence. "Ask any of them. Ask Seojin how many people he's ever let touch him. Ask Tiang how many people he's ever protected. This isn't supposed to happen. He's not supposed to matter." The air around Yohan went strange and heavy, gold light gathering at the edge of his vision, and the system window that flared open this time wasn't small text in the corner. It was massive, overlaid across his entire view, impossible to ignore. "Elimination sequence initiated. Extra number 27 has exceeded permitted narrative relevance. Stand by for removal." "No," Seojin said, stepping forward, and his voice was low and absolutely certain in a way 3 weeks of student council meetings had never once made it sound. "He's not an extra. I don't care what your files say." "He caught my food thief hands and never once complained about it," Daeon said, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Seojin, which was, in itself, possibly more shocking to the watching crowd than anything else that had happened all evening. "That's not nothing. He's mine to protect," Tiang said, flat, immovable, planting himself on Yohan's other side like a wall. "I never wanted to be the reason he disappeared." Minjun's voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment the golden, effortless charm that had carried him through the entire story fell away completely, leaving something younger and rower underneath. "I didn't choose to be written like this. I didn't choose for the 4 of you to matter more to me than anyone else in this entire world. I just wanted once for that to mean something back." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "And instead I watched all of you look at him, the way I've spent this whole story waiting for any of you to look at me." The courtyard had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that made every whispered word carry. "That's not his fault," Seojin said, quieter now, something almost like understanding threading through the words. "It was never going to be something you could win by being owed it, Minjun. That's not how any of this works. It never was." Jiho didn't say anything at all. Jiho just looked directly up, past the stage, past the lanterns, at whatever invisible authorship existed above all of them, and said clearly, deliberately, "I know how these stories work. There's always a rewrite clause. So rewrite it." The gold light surged, violent and blinding, and Yohan felt something enormous grab at the edges of his existence and pull. And then, all at once, 4 hands found him at once. Seojin's steady on his shoulder, Daeon's fierce around his waist, Tiang's locked tight over his own, Jiho's palm flat against his chest right over his hammering heart. And the light that had been trying to erase him met 4 points of stubborn, furious, undeniable devotion and simply stopped. Elimination sequence failed, insufficient narrative isolation. Character cannot be classified as expendable. Recommend permanent status change. Extra number 27, reclassified, new designation, main character. The gold light dissolved into nothing. The courtyard exhaled. Minjun stood alone on the stage, his 4 intended romances all standing protectively around someone else entirely. And for the first time since Yohan had arrived in this story, the protagonist looked less like a threat and more like a very young, very lonely man who'd built his entire self-worth around a plot that had just, quietly, moved on without him. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of story. But the lanterns kept glowing overhead, and Yohan stood in the middle of 4 boys who had all, independently, decided he was worth breaking a script for, and thought, distantly, that this was possibly the strangest and best thing that had ever happened to him. Part 11, Aftermath. Minjun didn't become a villain. He didn't need to. He simply stopped chasing 4 people who had never really been his to begin with, and much to Yohan's surprise, showed up a week later, awkward and stiff-shouldered, to mutter something that was almost an apology, before disappearing to go figure out, apparently for the first time, who he was without a script telling him. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy to watch. There were weeks where Minjun avoided all 5 of them so thoroughly it looked like a full-time job, and weeks after that where he'd show up at the edge of a group conversation, uncertain, like someone testing whether he was still welcome to exist near people who'd once been written to orbit him. Nobody made it dramatic. Dayon, predictably, was the one who finally just handed him a spare lunch tray one afternoon and said, "Sit down, you're making everyone nervous." And that, more than any grand reconciliation, was what finally let something in Minjun's shoulders unclench for good. He never did become part of whatever the 5 of them were building. But he stopped needing to, which turned out to be its own kind of ending, quieter, harder one, and entirely his. The 4 of them never did agree on how to explain what they were to anyone who asked. Siajin called it an arrangement. Dayon called it the best decision any of us ever made. Tiang refused to call it anything and just held Yohan's hand tighter whenever someone asked. Jiho predictably called it the only good plot twist in the entire game, and refused to elaborate further. There was no dramatic system window welcoming Yohan to a true ending. There was just a Tuesday that felt a little more solid than the Tuesday before it, a Wednesday where nobody's script mattered anymore, and a Thursday where Yohan realized, with something between panic and relief, that he had genuinely, thoroughly stopped thinking about how to leave. He still didn't know, some days, whether this world would let him stay forever, or whether some final, quieter version of the system was still out there somewhere, patiently waiting for a story like his to end the way stories usually did. But the fear of it had changed shape entirely. No longer the sharp, cold thing that used to keep him up counting exits, but something softer now, something he could set down most days and pick back up only rarely, because there were 4 people in his life who had made it very clear, in their own 4 different, stubborn languages, that they weren't going to let this story end without a fight either. Interlude, the rules, such as they were. It took roughly a month for anyone to actually sit down and discuss logistics, which Yohan found deeply funny in retrospect, because apparently 4 boys could unite against narrative erasure with 0 hesitation and still take 4 full weeks to work out a schedule. It was Siajin who finally called the meeting, because of course it was Siajin, arriving with an actual agenda written on actual paper, which Dayon immediately made fun of him for and Tiang immediately, silently, agreed with by refusing to look at it. "We are not doing a rotation chart," Dayon said, appalled. "I wasn't suggesting a rotation chart," Siajin said, in a tone that suggested he had, in fact, briefly considered a rotation chart and abandoned it only after significant internal debate. "I like structure," Jiho offered, unhelpfully, clearly enjoying this far too much. "I vote for the chart." "Nobody is voting on me like I'm a shared calendar event," Yohan said, from where he was sitting in the middle of all of them, deeply regretting every choice that had led to this exact conversation happening in his presence. In the end, the rules, such as they were, amounted to almost nothing at all. No chart, no rotation, no formal division of holidays. Just an unspoken agreement that jealousy wasn't allowed to win, that nobody got to disappear on the others just because things got complicated, and that whatever this was, it belonged to all 5 of them equally, or it didn't belong to any of them at all. Tiang put it best gruffly from the corner where he'd been pretending not to listen the whole time. "We already fought about this once, not doing it again." Nobody argued with that. Epilogue. 4 sons, 1 room. It became a habit nobody planned and nobody questioned. The 5 of them piled into Siajin's ridiculously oversized dorm room some evenings, because it was the only one big enough, doing homework that mostly didn't get done. There was always music playing too low to actually listen to. Always a half-finished snack someone had abandoned mid-conversation. Always the low, constant hum of 4 very different voices arguing amiably about nothing that mattered. It should have felt crowded. It never did. If anything, it felt like the first room Yohan had ever been in either world, where every version of him, the careful one, the panicking one, the one who'd once written "do not become plot relevant" on the back of his own hand, was allowed to exist all at once, without needing to hide any of it. Yohan ended up in the middle of the pile, as he usually did, because apparently that was simply where he lived now, Dayon's head in his lap, one of Tiang's arms slung heavy and possessive over his shoulders. Siajan's fingers laced loosely through his free hand, like he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to do that. Jiho stretched out across the foot of the bed with a book he wasn't reading, watching the whole scene with the quiet, satisfied look of a man who'd correctly predicted his own happy ending. "You know," Yohan said to the ceiling, to all of them, to the ridiculous, impossible shape his life had taken, "I came into this story trying very hard not to matter." "Terrible plan," Daeon said, without opening his eyes. "Worst plan I've ever heard," Tiang agreed, tightening his arm. "Glad it failed," Siajan said, quiet, and pressed a kiss to the back of Yohan's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Jiho just smiled over the top of his unread book and said nothing at all, because he'd known how this story ended long before any of the rest of them had. "You're staring," Yohan told him. "I'm allowed to stare," Jiho said. "I called this happy ending back in Chapter 1. I'd like a minute to enjoy being right." "Insufferable," Siajan muttered without any real heat in it. "Devastatingly correct," Jiho corrected, "is the phrase you're looking for." Daeon laughed into Yohan's shoulder, the sound vibrating warm through his whole chest, and Tiang's arm tightened around him in wordless agreement. And for a long moment nobody said anything else at all. Just the quiet shuffle of pages, the low hum of 4 heartbeats settled close. The particular kind of silence that only existed between people who'd stopped needing to fill it. Yohan closed his eyes, surrounded on every side, and thought, with something warm settling permanently into his chest, that being an extra had turned out to be the best role he'd never auditioned for. He had come into this story trying to matter as little as possible. He was leaving it, or not leaving it, not anymore, maybe never again, as the single most important thing 4 impossible, stubborn, glitching hearts had ever agreed on. That, he decided, was a plot twist worth staying for, the kind no wiki page, no forum theory, no developer diary had ever gotten close to predicting, because some endings simply refused to be written by anyone but the people living them. Final status update: character, Yohan. Classification no longer applicable. Story ongoing.